Hello, I'm Beth Miller. I'm the director of the Mississippi Course of Study and Licensed to Preach School here, located at the Center for Ministry at Millsaps College. And I come to you from the beautiful Yates Chapel here in the Christian Center. The thoughts and reflections that I'd like to share with you today come from the Gospel of John, the chapter 4. And this passage is most familiar and contains a lesson that is known as the woman at the well. And so for background purposes and contextual purposes, I'd like to read two brief passages with you and then share some thoughts and reflections and invitations for your own thoughts and reflections toward that. I'm reading from the Message, and may I begin at the very first of the chapter. Jesus realized that the Pharisees were keeping count of the baptisms that he and John performed, although his disciples, not Jesus, did the actual baptizing. They had posted the score that Jesus was ahead, turning him and John into rivals and in the eyes of the people. So Jesus left the Judean countryside and went back to Galilee. To get there, he had to pass through Samaria. He came into Sychar, a Samaritan village that bordered the field Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was still there. Jesus, worn out by the trip, sat down at the well. It was noon. A woman, a Samaritan, came to draw water. Jesus said, "Would you give me a drink of water?" His disciples had gone to the village to buy food for lunch. The Samaritan woman, taken aback, asked, "How come you, a Jew, are asking me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" Jews in those days wouldn't be caught dead speaking to Samaritans. Jesus answered, "If you knew the generosity of God and who I am, you would be asking me for a drink, and I would give you fresh, living water." And then moving over to beginning at verse 23. These are Jesus' words. "It's who you are and the way you live that count before God. Your worship must engage your spirit in the pursuit of truth. That's the kind of people the Father is out looking for, those who are simply and honestly themselves before Him in their worship. God is sheer being itself, spirit. Those who worship Him must do it out of their very being, their spirits, their true selves in adoration." This is God's good word for us, and we give our thanks to God. So the things that I'd like to ask you to receive my reflections on today are, who are the influencers and meaning makers in our lives? What were their life realities? And then this next point has become a seminal point for me. How is it, and I feel I must, get to know them better? In my own life, my parents were grounded meaning makers for me. Their life realities were that my dad was employed with a public utility and my mom was a homemaker. But it was the way they lived their lives before me and included me and my siblings that gave us groundedness in our faith. And so then an experience of a couple of years ago gave me another time to pause and give reflection to this question and this statement. I wish I had taken the time to get to know more about her. It was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. As you may recall, she died on September 18th 2020. She was 87 years old. She was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Here are the things that I knew about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I knew that she was the second woman on the Supreme Court. I knew that she was the first Jewish woman on the Supreme Court. I knew that over the course of her time as serving on the Supreme Court, that she had come to be identified as a stringent and strong component of the liberal ring on the Supreme Court. That was in essence what I knew. However, in the days after her death, as I watched several different occasions of memorializing her life, one in particular just was riveting to me because it just spoke so and enlarged so and enlightened so the much broader, richer, and deeper life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, far beyond those four marker point realities that I knew about her that I've mentioned. As I listened to all of those things about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, this came to me. I wish I had taken the time to know more about her. And so it has compelled me then, since then, to read more, to delve more, to look more intently into the life that was hers, not just the marker points that I knew about her. And so then today, this lesson, The Woman at the Well, that I'd like to think about this morning or this today as I'm sharing this with you as the time at the well. So the background scripture has told us that Jesus himself was on a journey. He was worn out. He was tired. He stopped for a drink of water. His disciples had go to get something to eat for he and themselves. He was here at a well, but he had no possible way to plumb down into the depths of the well to get the refreshing and life-giving water. And here this woman, a Samaritan woman, came, and she had the right equipment. And so Jesus asked her, "Would you give me a drink of water?" And she gave Jesus some pushback. She said, "Why are you asking me for a drink of water when ordinarily perhaps you might not even be speaking to me? I have something you need." And he said, "Yes." In a manner of speaking, he was saying, "You have something I need, but moreover, I have something that can give you life beyond any expectations you might ever have dreamt." And so they began this dialogue of conversation with each other. There was a reciprocity there in that there was give and take, there was engagement, there was sharing. And he began to push her a little bit and said, "Tell me about your husband." To which perhaps she felt called up short, and she said, "I don't have a husband." But without offering any chide to her, he said, "I realize that. And I realize that you've had 5 husbands. And I realize that the person that you're with now is not your husband." And so what did that do for her? She realized that here this was someone who knew far more about her than perhaps she even knew herself. What were her life realities that had prompted her, that had caused her, that had thwarted her, if you will, that had thrust her, if you will, into living in the life circumstances that she was. She needed to survive. And yet she knew she wanted a vibrant and full life. And so Jesus began to talk to her. And he began to tell her about what was really wanted for her life. He began to get to know more about her, even as he knew it already. And as she spoke with him, she got to know more about him. That brings me to this. Who is it among us today? And who are the meaning makers in our lives who give us identity and vibrancy and fullness? That really what we might know about them is just a thumbnail sketch of their lives until we take time to sit down and listen to them, to ask questions of them, to engage them, such that we can really come to know the depth of their whole being. That's what Jesus did with and engaged with the woman at the well. We know her not by name, but by gender and by location identity. He knew her in the reality and the fullness of who he saw her to be. So, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for those who are hearing the words that I offer? How am I a meaning maker for someone else? Who are persons who might like to get to know me better? But I have to be willing to stop and take the time to engage with them, to know them better, to not be so inquisitive as to seem that I'm being intrusive, but rather to be engaging, to getting to know, to wanting them to know that I care about who they are. That's what Jesus did regarding the woman at the well. He communicated and conveyed to her that he cared about who she was. I hope in my deepest being that I may be a meaning maker for someone else. I hope in my deepest being that the life that I live may be one whom others might want to know more about. I think the deepest piercing of this question for me is, of this thought is, who is the me that I need to know even more fully? I think sometimes, and I can only speak from personal experience, but that we get so busy going and doing that we take very little time for being. And in the course of the running and going and doing, do I spend enough time when I look in the mirror and I pose this reflection to myself? I wish I had taken the time to know you better. Meaning, all those things that are challenging to me, and yet at the same time, all those things that are deeply meaningful to me. Here's the thing about the woman at the well that is so poignant to me. She went from being known as a woman at a location, one whom I have heard described as the woman whom everybody spoke or talked about, but that nobody would talk to. She went back to her village. She forgot her water pot, but she went back to her village and she began to tell the people there all the revelations that had been made real and fresh and new to her. She said, come and see this man who knows far more about me than I even knew myself. You see, she went from one being ostracized to one being a witness, to one being an inviter, to one being a communicator of the divine love of God, who said to her, what God really cares about is the way you live your life before God. That's what counts. That's what counts. Referring back to my own lesson learned in watching a memorial service for a woman whose name was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, an activist, a jurist, a Jewish woman who was the second to occupy an associate justice position on the Supreme Court. Yet there was far, far more to Ruth Bader Ginsburg than merely that. The woman at the well who came to draw water in the middle of the day, who was willing to offer a drink of water to a Jewish man who in essence said, "I'm really thirsty." And she replied, "I'm really thirsty too." And then for me, my own self, I am a woman, and perhaps there are various wells at which I have encountered Jesus across my lifetime. Whenever I might have said, "Jesus, I am really thirsty." And he said to me, "Sweet one, dear one, I have water for you, and it will carry you throughout your whole life long." It is the time at the well that can make a significant, meaningful, and indeed leading to a witness-full life for each of us. I trust you may receive these words I offer to you today in reflection, and I hope that you might ponder them in your own reflections of the person whom you need most to get to know better. Amen.